guess on my part, this is going to be an embarrassing recording talking about things that I don't have robust, three-dimensional sort of perspective on. Uh, but I hope that someone can listen to this with an open mind, and I'm directing this at someone in particular, Dex. Uh, I'm not going to look up a surname now, but it'll probably be in the title of the video. Um, I've seen a lot of his content. Perhaps, perhaps I can't say a lot, but and I'm familiar as well with some of the things that he refers to, or at least I think relatively a majority of it. Perhaps not as much as would be necessary, but anyway, I'm just going to throw my hat into the ring, and I mean, because I would actually like to discuss theory with him. I would like to compare notes, as it were. I'm not a counselor. I don't have the kind of, probably the hours of experience that he has, but I do have more time devoted into developing technology. And probably more time thinking about it. And in some sense, it's been the majority of my life, from a very, very young age. And I've been working at it at a deep level from a very, very young age. So much so that my life is incredibly imbalanced and sort of freakishly peculiar and unconventional, which makes general situations difficult for me. But anyway, this is not so much a cry for help so much as it is an engagement on the substance that I've seen, because I do have, let's say, a speculative critique or a conjecturous sort of, so I don't know. So he's written this book called The Spiritual Compass, and I haven't read the book yet, but I think I understand the gist of it. And I haven't seen every single video on his YouTube channel, but I've seen other videos from him on other YouTube channels and his YouTube videos, some of them at least. And I am generally quite impressed with a lot of the content that he has. There is one thing that I have trouble believing, though, and that one thing is, let's say, the magic of the session in terms of the ability and capability of the counselor, let's just say. And in some sense, it has to do with that the spiritual compass is not sufficient, essentially, at least not in every context. It might be in some contexts. I think that if you don't have a large enough pool of people, in some sense, in communion with their spiritual gifts, the spiritual compass in certain contexts is not collaborating or coordinating with enough a full enough toolkit that you can arrive at a place, essentially. And you might be able to make progress and develop along certain lines, but if you don't have, let's say, all the gifts on board, and people don't have everything innately within themselves, it's not true. People have different gifts. And although they all have a spiritual compass, as I say, they don't all come packaged with everything. Okay, so that's a blanket statement, but I will sort of substantiate this point in a different way and also concretize it and refine it to some extent. So that's the kind of the heading of what I have to say. In particular, he has this wonderful video, which I think has a lot of interesting things in it, called It's Not Complicated. And he goes over the 4 things that he believes people need work done on. And I think that putting things into those categories, it's wonderful. It really, I think it's an over. He knows what he's talking about, but I am worried that one of those categories is also and this one of those categories is hard to get right, and it's not. You might repair the things that you come into contact with. You might be able to heal the wounds that present themselves to you and that come up, as it were, and that the spiritual now, obviously that's why you have to believe that the spiritual compass can divine or diagnose or sort of move you towards resolution, something like that, mystically. And there is a mystical force like that, and there is such a thing as a spiritual compass that is, in some sense, I would just call it the spiritual understanding and the state of spiritual understanding, which will naturally gravitate towards, let's say, bettering itself or quickening its condition, as it were, or quickening its state or spirit. The problem is that there is a problem with sufficiency of resource, and although you might be able to repair everything that becomes accessible, the problem can be just in the lack of access, which even the spiritual compass can't yet sort of broach, as it were, because perhaps it just doesn't have the opportunity, essentially. And therefore there are forms of knowledge which can at least map out what you could even call sections of nescience in terms of in relation to that spiritual compass. And there can be quite hard-baked nescience, or you call it sort of spiritual bad faith, or levels of intellectual bad faith even, that in terms of the persona, the false personas, that can be a kind of intellectual blueprint for, let's just say, that internal dysfunction, which the spiritual compass is actively engaged in that dysfunction and is therefore sort of corrupted by it or tainted by it. Now, it's easy when it's represented in a persona, and then you've got the head of the weed to pull on, and then you can see the root that follows it, but that's connected to it. But there's something else. There is something the issue of what I generally call the false ego, which I think it might straddle more than one category. It might, in terms of Dex's 4 canonical problems that need to be processed, and obviously even within his own process or therapy, I'm sure he realizes the interconnect and the bundling of some of these things. But what I call the false ego, I'm not sure if it would be linked to the false persona directly, although predominantly perhaps so, but it might also be linked to, what did he call them? The protective, what was the word? It means the stubborn protective sort of tactics, or the stubbornness which represents a kind of protective bulwark against something that is feared, and then negative conditions. Again, that's a sort of another thing, and I do think that a lot of these things are part of a recipe that, is what I would call the false ego. And these things are interconnected, and yes, it's very good to break them down and to deal with them in a separate process, as it were, because otherwise you never sort of decompose and confront and overcome the entire complex, as it were. I mean, I've only generally speculated on therapeutic measures in terms of the theory that I have developed around the false ego. That's actually what I would probably want to most talk to him about, because I've, you know, obviously he will know some of the structures that I have theoretically modeled, and then essentially how he confronts them. It would be very interesting to know that in some sense, but in some sense, I'm just afraid that the false ego is incredibly deep. And, you know, maybe his magical intuition within a session, he has this, you know, this power or whatever to actually diagnose exactly how deep the problem is, and he doesn't just tackle it in terms of whatever the client permits him, but actually sort of, or, you know, is he sort of guided into just creating a permissible environment in which he's just facilitating and being conducive to whatever, you know, is being self-reported. Because I mean, in a lot of cases that would be horrendously bad, because let's say the state of some people's spiritual compasses are just, they cannot be relied on in some sense. I mean, obviously as a practitioner that's somewhat problematic, because if you don't give your clients a good experience, then it's very hard perhaps to retain repeat business in some sense. Um, this is why I'm very uh, alarmed when I hear these simple, convenient concepts. Uh, and in some sense, you know, the spiritual compass is something that has to be worked with, because in some sense it is that person's guiding light of reason in some sense. And if you don't follow that thread and bolster that thread and feed that thread to some extent, but then, you know, you are essentially just overtly having to enforce a kind of indoctrination. But in some sense, the state of the spiritual compass, I think, in some people and in some forms of cases, might never lead you to accessing certain elements of what I've basically described as nescience on the level of the spiritual compass. Um, that the nescience is protected by an insulation, and that insulation does not even have to be manifest in any exterior behavior. It might not, in fact, it might even manifest as a kind of as almost an adaptive environmental mechanism, which in some sense is compensating for a sick society or a pathological culture. These things worry me, therefore, and in some sense, I think also the only way to sort of culturally fortify this problem is if there is a kind of canonical knowledge about the false ego. If there is, let's say, and that would be knowledge that would be separable to the spiritual compass, but it would be a kind of correlating source of knowledge, and these things must, I think, be sort of hand in hand. That the technologies of entreating the spiritual compass and developing it, as it were, or being guided by it, with it's almost like the I mean, there are analogies to this in terms of when they say that when you are studying, not studying, when you are learning to be proficient at something in the Eastern sort of tradition, that you, if you want to be a good martial artist or something like that, that you have to not only develop the strength and the stamina and the speed and the agility, but you also have to develop what they call the soft form, the kind of connecting with, this is such a superficial analogy, but and that the soft form will help you develop faster in terms of the hard form, because you'll be more centered, or whatever, and you'll be more um, collected and focused overall. Uh, Perhaps it's a weak analogy, but and in some sense, I think that obviously the practitioner or the therapist is essentially applying that hard theoretical aspect to some degree in entreating the spiritual compass, but in sort of centering it solely around the spiritual compass, which in some sense let's say that is the spiritual citizen that can be part of something, but the idea that it is just basically self-sufficient. In some sense, we wouldn't have. It's just, it's sort of like yes, but. Yes, it is kind of self-sufficient, but you know, if we didn't ever have the false ego coming into the picture, we don't know to what level of denigration, let's just say, and because that's a rational problem of knowledge that you're creating, which is fundamentally insoluble. Perhaps, but essentially, I mean, I, I think Dex understands some of this. That that you get to a place and there's no solidity in some sense. That there's always a new thing. There's always a new sort of upgrade in some sense, or there's always there's a spiritual understanding yet to be developed. And I do think that there is a kind of solid state edifice that actually does get created at some point, and it is a kind of culture that gets crystallized with a certain kind of bare minimum. And in some sense, that bare minimum, I think, is something like the spiritual compass, but also a kind of solid account of the structures of at least the false ego. It's not in understanding the positive, it's in understanding the negative, I believe. It's in understanding the pathology that gives us that solid spiritual edifice. And that doesn't come packaged with the spiritual compass. The spiritual compass might know that there's something wrong, that there's something off in some sense. But in some sense and in some sense, there's no perfection, there's no ideal in that sense, that there's always a flow towards something. There's always a change happening in some sense. But I do think that there is actually a transition in where the change, that yearning in some sense, or that spiritual need, is just a continual quickening in some sense, and it is still growing in knowledge and understanding and wisdom. But there is a kind of edifice in that knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, and I do think that it's more than just the spiritual compass. Obviously, in some sense, Dex is describing these things, and I am just afraid that the positive spiritual compass is, in some sense, taking prominence and displacing the hard understanding of pathological structures, and of which I think that what he calls false persona, I'm afraid that it's a deeper well than he realizes. I know that he knows how deep it. I know that he knows that it is pretty deep, but I think it's even deeper yet still. That that the fine tuning of what I've called perhaps the perfected vanity yeah, I mean, perhaps, and he perhaps has experiences that I could learn a lot from. But in some sense, the issue is that my current theoretical speculation around therapy is that the kind of false ego that I talk about, which is not the same thing as false personas and enacting false personas, but is connected to that, can be. I believe that the false ego, in some sense, can never be fully bleached out of a person. That its faculties and structures do remain, but essentially it's used as a kind of antenna to navigate what I would use some scriptural, spiritual jargon or whatever, to navigate worldly karmic messed energies. And that earthen vessel in some sense then is run from a different teleological purpose orientation, which is not the same as the ordinary false ego that is effectively bound in a kind of contract in which the superego, and okay, this is jargon, but essentially that the original self created this sort of this puppet, which is the false ego, to have a kind of a game that they could play and control, and that game is essentially like the game of the world, and it operates through a kind of self-image, which I generally call in spiritual language the beast. But essentially all that means is that that image then has to be rationally aligned with all other images. And so all meaning in the mind that is mentally actuated or contemplated, or the actual contents of cognition itself, is all part of a web of rationalization, which is effectively premised on that self-image, which has essentially come to display, which you could say is the residue of a contract, which has come to displace, let's just say, liberty itself, in terms of being able to be free to choose. So the understanding of one's own liberty, the understanding of one's own power of reason and liberty through that power of reason, is captured by the image, and then the web of images and image thinking, in some sense. I mean, the secondary image thinking, in some sense, is just, it doesn't have to necessarily be an image. I mean, in some sense, image here doesn't mean necessarily an image, but it's a signature of within the mind. It has a resonance, you could say, and so that resonance becomes, let's say, the context within the mind that is the smaller context in a greater realm of possibility, and that greater realm of possibility is cut off is voided. It's abrogated into the abyss. It's nullified. And in some sense, it's as if it never existed, and that's seeing existence from within the false ego. That there's no alternative. You're in the system of the beast, as it were. You're within the box of the false ego, and in some sense, the box of the false ego has many things in it that are working against itself, that have negative feedback, that have and just perfecting that is, I think, an important step. And I think that almost the spiritual compass that's more what it's prone into trying to facilitate, because it's incredibly it's disconcerting just having a false ego complex. I mean, in some sense, many of the false ego complex, many of the aspects in the false ego were created to try to distance itself from its own failure. I mean, it fails like on 3 different levels, and it just doubles down and continues onward. And in some sense, the ego function is its best hope at a resolution or reconciliation of its own internal dysfunction. So it gets tired managing its own dysfunction, and it wants a solution to that. And I do think that much of the spiritual compass is that inclination, is the inclination of the ego function wishing to mature itself, but also wishing for stability and stabilization of its internal structures, and help at curating those internal structures. And it does need help in doing that. I do think that part of the spiritual path is to, in some sense, perfect the false ego. And that does, and then there are other internal plays within the false ego. It's a hodgepodge of many different corners of, I think it's depicted in scripture as having the beast with 7 heads that rule for a time. 7 heads and 10 crowns and 10 horns. It's complicated, and some of those aspects are very important, and they do need to be perfected, because otherwise you can't condense, let's say, the false prophet contract that even got you into this into a lake of fire in order to restrict the functioning of the false ego so that it can be transcended. In some sense, it has to be made still, and it has to be cleaned up so that consciousness can ascend from it. After the descent, one must descend before one ascends, and I do think that the spiritual compass is still embroiled in just trying to have a stable descent in some sense, and perhaps it can't actually see the ascent. In fact, the encompassing resolution, in some sense, I feel like it might just settle for a narrative. It might just settle for a story. That's a kind of perennialism or something like that, which is why I've always thought of perennialism as being one of the most retro, reactionary, spiritual sort of corners. But anyway, retrograde, I guess, was the word that I was looking for. Anyway, so I've really just taken a And I don't think you get the ascent unless you actually grapple with the beast, as it were, and the forces of the beast, and the heads of the beast, and the false prophet, and the lake of fire, and whatever metaphorical language you might want to employ. Unless you do that, and you do that process authentically and genuinely, and I do think that almost a lot of that doesn't happen with just the spiritual compass. You need a bit more. I mean, perhaps with some people it would. Perhaps some people, they have the gift of the apostle. But for those who don't have a very strong gift of the apostle, and I think it might even be quite a rare gift, I don't think that their spiritual compass, if they're not in communion with that gift, if they're not feeling the spiritual pressure of that gift bearing upon their witness in themselves, I don't know if they'll have the let's say the authentic process of actually being able to grapple with these things sufficiently to extricate themselves from the depth of the problem of the false ego complex, which I'm not sure is exactly the same thing when Dex talks about false persona. In some sense, valences, I mean, for me, it's a bit of a, because in some sense what could be happening is that you are jettisoning, let's say, the what was it called again, the stubborn protective layers of tactical sort of emotional, whatever it might be, the stubborn sort of reactivity. I can't actually remember the whole phrase. So it was something about stubborn protective reactive tendencies or something like that. And then you might be able to jettison those things and sort of flush away the false persona that sort of conglomerate around someone's case or whatever, and then you might actually have just pushed the reset button and sort of cleared the cache, the sort of the memory banks. You've just sort of like given them a nice thorough spring cleaning and emptied them out, and so they can sort of begin again more slowly. They can just kind of, because now they have the room to be like when they were younger, and to basically to redevelop the same, because the container was just full, so they couldn't continue. But now that they can go back to building essentially a new, to repopulating their false ego complex, because essentially the fundamental structure of the categorization it's had its bones picked clean, but the skeleton essentially, I don't even believe that the skeleton is capable of being disintegrated. Sometimes because it's part of your spiritual record that you actually did it. You actually did fool yourself. You actually did contract into these things. You actually did have a false prophet contract, and how are you going to get away from that? How are you going to execute the contract? Are you going to have non-execution? How is it going to be resolved? And in some sense, I think that it does have to be saved. I even think that is what becomes archetypally known as the Son of God. It actually must be, this is why, anyway, this is, if I go into religious, I mean, to me, you could, I use the religious language because I think it's a good, it makes it easier to picture to some degree. It makes it easier to sort of point at the concept, but it's not important. In some sense, this could be, in some sense, I understand it to be a secular philosophy to some extent, and I think that actually the scriptures are a secular philosophy. If you read 1 John chapter 5, it says exactly that this understanding is what is eternal life and God, and that the life is in the Son. And believing on the name of the Son of God, that's all in the same in 1 John chapter 5. It's a completely secular philosophy. It's about loving the brethren. It's about a spiritual culture. It's not that Christ is the Christ consciousness, which is what is being talked about in 1 John chapter 4, that the core of the faith. Anyway, I mean, it also talks about, in Corinthians, that we have the mind of Christ, and it talks about the sons of God all over the place in the New Testament. Anyway, the regard of the false ego as actually being the Son of God is not the tricky bit. The tricky part is precipitating the Son of Man, which is how this Son of God is essentially actualized and come into manifestation in some sense only after the false ego is seen in its proper context from before it was created, from the superego position. So essentially the superego position essentially must become the Son of Man, and it's the Son of Man that makes the Son of God in appearance. And so, I mean, even in the Old Testament, they knew that they were the sons of God in some sense, but there's no point in talking about it because they've fallen. And it was, well, how are we going to get out of the mess? And essentially you need the technology of the Son of Man, because the Son of Man is also the Son of God, essentially, or is the spiritual key. Anyway, going into the religious metaphor perhaps is not helpful, but this kind of more concrete understanding and categorization of things, I think the details have to be worked out, the details have to be understood to get the full and proper picture of these things. And just the willy-nilly spiritual compass yeah. But anyway, so that's my open invitation. That's my sort of conjecturous critique. And then, a lot of my YouTube channel is just me talking about some of my research, although it's probably very confusing and hard to follow because I haven't made available perhaps all my sort of charts, things like that. But yeah, I mean, I haven't finished with my models and my research and such, which is something that I have to. I mean, this has really been the majority of my life since I was 7 years old. I've been actively working on this project. It has consumed the majority of my existence. Very easy to say that.